Yeah. Okay. Alright, we're good. The origins of Prohibition. Ready? Okay. Well, a lot of it stemmed from the saloons and the brewing industry which developed in this time period. In the late 19th century, the brewing industry became very lucrative. German immigrants who were coming into America, they brought lager beer with them, and it quickly became very popular throughout the country. Another reason why the brewing industry and saloons specifically became so popular was technological advances that were occurring in America. The railroad, the telegraph, mechanical refrigeration allowed them to transport, over long distances. So brewers were able to form vast, vertically integrated, like Carnegie's method. They were capable of widespread distribution throughout the entire country rather than just brewing it and serving it. You could, produce massive amounts of beer and ship it out to various locations. So saloons started to spring up. These were retail establishments that sold liquor, usually beer. They were directly financed by the brewers themselves, and they proliferated throughout the entire country. Some towns had one saloon for every 150 to 200 people. In Great Neck, that would be like hundreds. Many saloon owners used other vices such as gambling, prostitution, and rooster fighting in order to make an extra profit and to bring more people into their saloons. So this pursuit of profit that the saloons were undergoing caused a lot of dissent in the towns because they didn't like having this in their neighborhood. So they started to become perceived as dirty, immoral, and sinful places. And so organizations such as the Anti-Saloon League, which I believe Lizzie is going to speak about later, they sprung up in an attempt to put an end to the profusion of saloons and to drinking in general, really. Another big factor for the opposition to drinking, immigration and religious differences. All of these tensions were going on at the time, and it's a big factor for the Prohibition movement. The cities were becoming increasingly populated by Catholic immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. The Old Wave and the New Wave had a lot of tension between them. The Old Wave were mostly Protestant. A lot of them were living in rural areas rather than urban. Most of them were from Western or Central Europe. The new immigrants were coming in from the South, Eastern Europe, and they were Catholic and they had very different cultures, and this caused, some questions. So some scholars have said that the origins of temperance and prohibition movements are part of a cultural war between the Protestant residents and the newer immigrants who are different. A lot of the brewers, the brewers who distributed all the beer, they were of German origin, and so groups like the Anti-Saloon League attacked them for this, going after their different culture as a way to drive a wedge between them, and to spin them as negative and spin drinking as negative. So what they did was they published racist propaganda posters characterizing Germans as being alcoholics and gluttons. The leader of the Anti-Saloon League, which was one of the most prominent in the country at the time, a guy named William Anderson, he was very, very racist and xenophobic. He went after Jews, Irish, Italian, and other immigrant groups whose cultures had alcohol as a major component. He thought alcohol was immoral, and so if your culture involved alcohol in, some sort of major way, then your culture was immoral. Prohibition was largely a Protestant moral crusade. A lot of Methodist groups were very, very anti-drinking, and the roots can be seen all the way back in Puritanism. It's a pretty similar idea, the idea of morally purging all of the sinful things people were doing. The Anti-Saloon League saw itself actually and portrayed itself as being a Protestant Christian religious movement. So even though their focus was on attacking drinking, they made sure that people knew they were Protestant. It was coming from a religious perspective more than just, a secular or social perspective. Fundamentalist churches were a major factor in the movement. They all worked together to try to eradicate the consumption and also the sale of alcohol because they viewed it as being morally impure. Women were a major factor in Prohibition as well, in large part because alcohol consumption increased the frequency of domestic violence. So they saw it as destroying their families, destroying their homes. Their husbands, fathers, would become violent towards their children or wives, and they viewed alcohol as being the reason for this. And so, because they had seen firsthand what alcohol can do to people, they viewed alcohol as a dangerous and violent thing, and they wanted to just eliminate it from American society. So groups started to spring up, on the foundation of women. Women's Christian temperance movement had up to 150,000 members at its peak. That's a lot. They were formed to fight saloons specifically, but also on a more broad level, just alcohol in general, try to eliminate its influence on American culture. So the movements were very effective. They were very influential. Everyone knew about them. And they demonstrated on a national level the power of women to organize politically. So this picture depicts women going into a saloon and getting rid of all the alcohol, pouring it out, getting rid of it. That's what they wanted to do. And here you can see them fighting, like physically fighting the influence of alcohol. So a lot of the origins of Prohibition were women fighting, trying to make a difference in getting rid of something that they saw as being a dangerous and harmful influence.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the three different groups that mainly contributed to Prohibition and creating reforms throughout the nation. So the first group is the American Temperance Society, established in 1826, and Lyman Beecher and Justin Edwards were the founders. It was the first ever national temperance movement in the nation, so it was really like a big change that was occurring. People really weren't used to it, so it took some time to get support. Their main goal was trying to have everyone throughout the nation restrained from drinking, specifically distilled spirit, wine, and but they said distilled spirit, wine, and beer were okay. So they were pretty successful in creating the first foundation for the whole temperance movement. They didn't really get very extreme reforms to come about, but it was sort of like the founding and the base for the rest of the movement. They said that temperance was a suggestion and prohibition was mandatory, and they later, through different groups, got it enforced through the 18th Amendment. The next group is the Prohibition Party. It was formed in 1869 by John Russell. They claimed that alcohol consumption led to illness, abuse, and poverty. So they tried to find all of the negatives about alcohol and get everyone to view it as something bad, so they would gain support. And they said that by removing alcohol and the consumption and the distribution would make society more good and perfect. They successfully pressured towns and counties to enact prohibition reforms and laws. So they were forceful in what they wanted to do, and that was successful. But they weren't effective in getting their party members to be elected into official positions. So that it made it more difficult to get reforms to be, laws to be enacted. And the highest position held by someone in this party was the governor of Florida, which isn't that high of a position, so it kind of was a setback to the whole group. A success was the creation of the 18th Amendment. It was enforced and taken very seriously, but around 1933, the party began to decline as prohibition was being repealed, and their whole campaign was vote dry. That was their main message, and they tried to get it across throughout the nation. And as Josh said before, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was extremely big in the national movement for prohibition. It was founded in 1874 by Frances Willard, and their main goal was to limit consumption of alcohol by Americans. The women saw alcohol consumption and drinking as hand in hand with domestic violence and abuse, so a lot of women were spurred into action and saw it as their way to empower themselves to make changes in their home and throughout the nation. One of their main goals that they wanted to achieve was to educate young children about the ills and evils of alcohol, because a lot of people had this vision that alcohol was something fun and something that was social with the saloons and such, but they really saw it as completely negative and only led to bad things. So by 1901, every state had at least some program to inform young kids in school about the evils of alcohol. That was pretty successful because that was what they wanted to do, and they got their message across, especially to the youth. Their union failed to gain statewide prohibition in Tennessee, so that was something that they didn't get to achieve. But after Willard died, this union was overtaken by the Anti-Saloon League, which was a more powerful union because it was male-dominated. So the women weren't taken as seriously because they were women. Okay, the Anti-Saloon League was founded in 1893. It became a national organization by 1895, and it was one of the most influential prohibition lobbies in the United States. This was kind of a combination of everything that was leading up to it, so all of the unions that created a basis for the whole movement. This was kind of like the main mixture of everything. Their goal was to close down saloons and ban the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol. They said that the saloon must go. They saw it as completely wrong and there was no exceptions. They had the mindset that if Americans could not easily access alcohol, then consumption would decrease. So they thought that if they took away all the saloons and attacked it from that point, everything that had to do with alcohol would be done. The way that the league got support was by appealing to local churches. So they had the priests preach their messages across, and then after they gained local support, they moved to gain support from politicians. So whatever politician and officer held their view and promoted it, they got the vote of the people. So that was kind of like a little thing that they used to get a lot of support. They were really relying on propaganda to gain support and members for their dry cause. And the major success of all these groups was the 18th Amendment, which was enacted in 1920, and America was officially dry. It banned the sale and consumption of alcohol, and that was the main goal of this. So overall, the groups were pretty successful, except for a few setbacks that were occurring.
Federal legislation. So, in 1917, the House of Representatives had pushed to make prohibition, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution under the Postal Act. The amendment had been up to 7 years to be voted on and ratified. But after being voted on amongst states for only 13 months, the amendment passed. The amendment had entailed restriction on manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic liquors, so they could not really come into the country or spread around. The onset of the 18th Amendment had many positives as liquor consumption dropped drastically, and that also led to arrests for drunkenness to fall a lot. Alcohol consumption had been lowered around 30% during Prohibition, and hard liquor consumption had dropped 50%. The average price for illegal alcohol increased much higher than the average worker could afford, so not that many people were actually drinking as much as they were before. Problems of enforcement. Although the sale and the manufacture and transportation of alcohol had been illegal, many people had still, been really disobedient and did it anyway. So, it had been really challenging to enforce prohibition. Over the next few years, the illegal sale had been known as bootlegging and skyrocketed throughout the country. So while the federal government did not have the means to enforce prohibition as well as they could, so in 1925, there had been over 30,000 speakeasies within New York City. And if you think about that, that's a lot of speakeasies where they're holding, illegal substances. Alcohol was in strikingly high demand. This led to an abundance of people to, try to bypass encounters with police officers to get away with drinking, in public. So they had carried hollowed books, canes, and hip flasks containing alcoholic liquors in order to, not
Be obvious.
Yeah, not to be obvious with their drinks. This law, lax enforcement of prohibition stricken the country with violence and rebellion against federal law.